As we get into the 16th chapter of Mark, it should be acknowledged that some have put a question mark or a doubt on the last portion of this chapter, beginning with verse 9 to the end. And the reason for the doubt or the questioning as to the accuracy or the authenticity of this portion of the chapter is because in two of the oldest manuscripts, this portion is deleted. That is the manuscript known as the Sinaiticus and the other manuscript known as the Vaticanus. Back in the middle of the 1800s, a man by the name of Tischendorf was down at the St. Catherine's Monastery in the area of the Sinai. And he discovered there in the monastery this ancient vellum that was actually being used more or less for kindling. And in examining it, realized that it was an old copy of the Scriptures, perhaps one of the oldest copies extant as far as the amount of the text that was there. And upon the announcement of this discovery in the Vatican, shortly afterwards, they pulled out this ancient manuscript from the Vatican, which is known as the B manuscript. The Codex Sinaiticus is called the Aleph. And they found that these manuscripts were quite similar. Not completely similar. There are differences in the two manuscripts themselves. And when they were going to revise the Bible, the two men who had a great deal to do with the revision were Westcott and Hort. They were Greek scholars, and they put together a Greek text which relied heavily upon the Codex Sinaiticus and the Codex Vaticanus, these two ancient texts. It should be noted that these texts do date back in the year 420, 30, somewhere in there, as best they can determine. Because in these two texts, the last portion of Mark's gospel is deleted, they felt that it was necessary in the revised text to delete it, or at least to make notations that it was not found in some of the oldest manuscripts. And you will find many notes like this in many of your modern translations. Many times it's called the oldest manuscripts, and sometimes they even have the audacity to call them the best manuscripts. I say audacity because there's a real challenge as to really how good these manuscripts really are. Let me read what some of the scholars at that time, mainly Scrivener and Dean Burgeon, had to say concerning the Codex Sinaiticus, which they put great credence upon. It says, since the documents were first inscribed, they were made subject to no less than 10 different attempts of revision and correction. That is, places that were crossed out, and revisers who went through, 10 different revisers went through and made changes, many of them as late as the 6th to the 8th century. Dr. Scrivener published in 1864 a full collation of the Codex Sinaiticus with the explanatory introduction, in which he states, among the other facts of interest is that the Codex is covered with such alterations. alterations that were obviously of a correctional character. So brought in by at least 10 different revisers, some of them systematically spread over every page, others occasional or limited to separate portions of the manuscript. Many of these being contemporaries with the first writer, for the greater part belonging to the 6th to the 7th century. We are sure that every intelligent reader will perceive, and with little effort, the immense significance of this feature of the Sinaitic Codex. Here is a documentation which the revisers have esteemed, and solely they've esteemed the Codex Sinaiticus, but solely because of its antiquity, to be so pure that it should be taken as the standard whereby all other copies of the Scriptures are to be tested and corrected. Such is the estimate of certain scholars of the 19th century, but it bears upon its face the proof that those in whose possession it had been from the very first and for some hundreds of years thereafter esteemed it to be so impure as to require corrections in every part. The Bible has been subject to what is called higher criticism. Those who come to the Bible with a presupposition that it is like any other ancient text and to be studied like any other ancient text is not really the inspired Word of God, and they seek to find fault and they seek to find contradictions and proofs that the Bible is not really inspired by God and inerrant. These men have been hammering at the Bible for years. And from this school of higher critics come such men as Westcott and Hort, who, using the Codex Sinaiticus and the Codex Vaticanus, made their own Greek text upon which the Revised Version and practically every other modern version has been taken. There are two basic families of text, and that is the Alexandrian school, from which the Vaticanus and the Sinaiticus have come with that family of text. And then there is, of course, the received text that encompasses the majority of the text. Now, it should be noted that the majority of the text has this latter portion of Mark in it. It is only the two manuscripts that we had mentioned earlier that do not have the last portion of Mark's gospel. It is interesting, however, that this last portion of Mark's gospel is quoted by many of the early church fathers who died long before Codex Sinaiticus was ever copied. Back in the early years of church history, Irenaeus, who lived from 140 to 202, he quotes from this last portion of Mark's gospel. Now, if you are using the Codex Sinaiticus primarily because it's the oldest document, and you say, because it's the oldest, it's probably the most correct, then you have to explain what document was Irenaeus quoting from 200 years before this was ever written. And Hippolytus, who also lived from 170 to 235, quotes from this last portion of Mark's gospel. Certainly, they were quoting from earlier manuscripts. So this idea that because of its antiquity that it has to be correct is sort of blown out of the window, because you have Bible teachers quoting from this last portion of Mark's gospel. So let me read you what Dean Burgeon said concerning the Codex Sinaiticus. He is not very high on it, to say the least. He speaks of the impurity of the Codex Sinaiticus. In every part, it was fully recognized by those who were best acquainted with it. There are other characteristics of this old manuscript which have to be taken into consideration if a correct estimate of its evidential value is to be reached. Thus, there is internal evidence that lead to the conclusion that this was the work of a scribe who was singularly careless or incompetent, or both. In this manuscript, the arrangement of the lines is peculiar, there being 4 columns on each page, and each line containing about 12 letters, all of them capitals that are run together. In other words, there's no attempt to separate the words, just all of the letters run together in all capitals. And there is no attempt to end a word at the end of a line, for even words having only 2 letters, such as N and Ek, are split in the middle, the last letter being carried over to the beginning of the new line. I mean, it's really a very peculiar text, to say the least, though there was ample room for it on the preceding line. And this and other peculiarities give us the idea that the character and the competence of the scribe, probably done by some kindergartner. But more than that, Dr. Scrivener says this manuscript must have been derived from one in which the lines were similarly divided, since the writer occasionally omits just the number of letters which would suffice to fill a line. In other words, he omitted whole lines, and there were enough letters to fill that line, but they were just omitted. And that to the utter ruin of the sense, and that is, the way they wrote it, it just doesn't make sense at all with the omission of that line. As if his eye had just sort of wandered to the line that was immediately below. Dr. Scrivener states that instances where complete lines are omitted and others where the copyist passed in the middle of a line to the corresponding portion of the line below. So left off the end and the first portion of the next line. From this, it is evident that the work of copying was done by a scribe who was both heedless and incompetent. A careful copyist would not have made the above or other mistakes so frequently, and only the most incompetent would have failed to notice upon reading over the page to correct the omissions which utterly destroyed the sense. In other words, had he bothered to even read over what he had written, he would have realized that he missed that line, and he would have inserted it to fill in so that it would make sense. And so, speaking of the character of the 2 oldest manuscripts, Dean Burgeon says, the impurity of the text exhibited by these codices is not a question of opinion, but of fact. In the Gospels alone, Codex B, that is the Vaticanus, leaves out words or whole clauses no less than 1,491 times. It bears traces of careless transcription on every page. Codex Sinaiticus abounds with errors of the eye and the pen to an extent not indeed unparalleled, but happily rather unusual in documents of first-rate importance. On many occasions, 10, 20, 30, 40 words are dropped through very carelessness. Letters and words, even whole sentences, are frequently written twice over or begun and immediately canceled, while that gross blunder whereby a clause is omitted because it happens to end with the same words as the clause preceding occurs no less than 115 times in the New Testament. And so the Codex Vaticanus differs from the received text in the following particulars. It omits at least 2,877 words. It adds 536 words. It substitutes 935 words, and it transposes 2,098 words, and it modifies 1,132, making a total of 7,578 verbal divergences. But the Sinaitic is even worse. Its total divergences are over 9,000. So, when you read some of the most ancient manuscripts, as they have notated in many of the Bibles, and those that skip the last part of Mark, or those that put it in, so often put, this portion is omitted in some of the most ancient manuscripts. Those manuscripts are two, the Sinaiticus and the Vaticanus, of which we've just read to you how sloppily they were done. So that to omit it doesn't really finish the story of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Listen to the last verse of, that is 8, before they get to this which was omitted in these two manuscripts. And they went out quickly and fled from the sepulchre, for they were troubled and were amazed. Neither said they anything to any man, for they were afraid. Isn't that a great place to leave the story? Running away afraid to talk about it, end of story. And we don't even have the proofs of the resurrection yet. We don't have Jesus appearing to Mary Magdalene and all. It cuts it off right there. Obviously, no place to cut off the story. Don't be deceived into thinking that when someone says, some of the finest manuscripts that we have, Codex Sinaiticus, one of the lousiest manuscripts we have. And to put a lot of credence on it is just sheer ignorance or deliberate deception. It is a poor manuscript. And thus to put so much credence in it as was done by Westcott and Hort, you have to look for other motives. Now, I do not buy into the New Age theory that it was a part of the New Age plot. I think that the value of that book, New Age Versions, is not in trying to discover a conspiracy of New Agers to change the Bible. But I think the value of that book is the comparison of text side by side so that you can see the changes that have been made in the modern translations versus the King James. It should be noted that the King James Version was a translation of the received text, or the Textus Receptus, as was, of course, Martin Luther's translation, Wycliffe's, and all of these translations come from the received text. That is what is also known as the majority of text. You see, where this is deleted in two manuscripts, it is included in over 1,000 manuscripts. So you have a vote of 1,000 to 2. But for some reason, they've put greater credence on the 2 than the other 1,000 that have come over to us from a variety of sources, all agreeing together and coming out at the end in agreement against these 2, of which, as we pointed out, in one over 7,000 changes and the other over 9,000 changes.